Good afternoon, everybody. So we have chosen a vibrant resource person with a very important and relevant topic for the session today. The topic we all know, a judgment which is path-breaking in the case between Vinit Sharma versus Rakesh Sharma, and the resource person is beloved Mr. P. Vijay Raghunath, an advocate of Coimbatore. And he was born in the year 1967 and a degree holder in commerce, later did his law, and father was one of the leading lawyers of the bar, and he has put up more than 26 years of good practice, and one of the highly admired advocates of Coimbatore and places around it. And his library is worth mentioning about because I've heard about his library through a lot of friends. And he has been a legal advisor for a lot of top-notch companies in and around Coimbatore, Lakshmi Group of companies, LG Group of companies, Pricol, HDFC, and the Airport Authority of India. And he has written a lot of articles in law journals, and his erudition is already known to us. Today, we are happy to have Mr. Vijay Raghunath with us as the resource person. May I now invite Mr. Vijay Raghunath to commence his session. Sir, you are welcome. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Srinivas Raghavan. First and foremost, I thank you for inviting me as the resource person for the today's session. And the topic that you gave me, namely a critical analysis of the Vinit Sharma case, is something that I like very much, namely Hindu law. So once again, thanks to you. Before we start, maybe I should give a foreword or a forewarning, which is twofold. One, see, this exercise is not about criticizing the judgment of the Supreme Court in Vinit Sharma's case. See, as you know, Hindu law is always known for having several schools of thought. So we are just going to analyze the judgment from a different school of thought as to the interpretation of Section 6. So let's not run the risk of contempt. Secondly, this is not about gender. I'd like to make it clear that I also have a daughter. So uh, it's more about an academic interpretation of Section 6 rather than saying that only sons should have share or daughters should not have share. In fact, I find this calling this Hindu law a social evil bordering on absurdity, because Hindu law is a law that has been there for thousands and thousands of years. It was formulated, followed thousands and thousands of years back when the society was different, man was different, or women were different. See, now we are in the 21st century. Times have changed. Our social fabric has changed. So if you are going to take 21st century, the fabric of the society in 21st century, and then interpret a law of, say, centuries old and say that that's a social evil, I think that would not be fair. But having said that, see, I would suggest, particularly to my lady friends who are here, saying that I am not against share to daughters. But the exercise is not that. See, as they say, we have to interpret the law as it stands and what it ought to stand for, not what it ought to stand for. So, what does Section 6 say? Is the exercise of this session, and let's see how it goes. Before we get into Vinit Sharma's case, I think I will briefly give a background as to how this law of co-partnery has evolved, which most of you should know. Yes, see, it is like this. A co-partnery, as you know, is a body of male members up to a generation of 4 generations in a Hindu family. The body is a fluctuating body. Members will come in by birth, members will go out by death. The body remains. And the unique concept is the properties of the family belongs to that co-partnery. See, that never goes out. See, as long as secondly, what is most important is, particularly in the context of Section 6, is that a co-partnery does not get segregated or destroyed by a death of a person or by a birth of a person. It continues. by the death of a person or birth of a person, the shares fluctuate, but the coparcenary continues to exist. And as long as the coparcenary exists, the share of each copartner remains unascertained. The ascertainment happens only when there is a breaking of the coparcenary. So this was the concept up to 1956. In 1956, as I said, the coparcenary was consisting of only the male members. So in 1956, or there were enactments even prior to that, let's not go there. The watershed year was 1956. The enactment being Hindu Succession Act. The law that was, the change that was brought into in that law is that, see, in fact, it was not even about coparcenary. See, they said when a male Hindu dies, right, the property of that male Hindu, right, will devolve. In a normal coparcenary, it would have remained in the coparcenary and it would have gone to the other copartners, the surviving copartners in the coparcenary. That would have been the normal route, which is called the survivorship. What they said was, in the when a male dies after 1956, a Hindu male having properties, then that property will, if he leaves behind a female heir, because the intention of the act was to confer right on female heirs. They said the property will devolve on the female heirs and not by survivorship. See, that was the change that was brought about. See, this was the position. I'm not getting into the details. Maybe we'll get into the details a little later. See, this was the position that continued till the 1980s, where then they thought that, look here, the daughters are being given share only in the father's share, not in the entire coparcenary property or in the share of the entire branch in the coparcenary. So they thought, look here, the daughter should be treated like equal to that of a son. Why should the son have a preferential right or a higher right? So with this in mind, there was a spate of state litigation legislations where they said daughters will have a share. For example, if we take Tamil Nadu enactment, Act 1 of 1990, see, they said if the daughter remained unmarried as of 27/3/1989, right, the daughter will also become a co-partner and get a share equal to that of a son. See, this was the amendment that was brought in. So the right that was conferred, see, again, as in the 2005 Act, which I'll come to a little later, see, the right was given on and from the Act. That is 1 of 1990. They said on and from that Act, a daughter who remains unmarried will also become a co-partner and get an equal share. That was the 1990 Act. Then they thought further, look here, why only unmarried daughters? What about married daughters? What sin have they committed by getting married? So they thought that, look here, let us also confer the right on married daughters. So came the Act 39 of 2005, the Central Act, which said, like, all daughters on and from 9/9/2005, all daughters will become a co-partner and get an equal right as that of a son. So the object behind the legislation has been noble, to give equal rights to the daughter. But the problem was not prospective. See, the problem was not from on and from the date how the daughter gets the share was not a problem. The problem was what happens to properties or families, the situation in which in the families in which certain things had happened by way of a partition or way of a death, whatever, before 1990 or before 2005. So this has landed this act in a soup, because I feel, I might be wrong, that the parliament was not a body that was competent or in the comprehension of this law as required to make an amendment. But it made an amendment saying that, look here, you will get a share. Then came the interpretation of the courts, because the domain, the entire jurisdiction of interpreting what that section says or what the parliament intended is on the courts. Then courts started interpreting section 6 as to what happens to the properties, say from 1990 in case of unmarried daughters, and say from 2005 in case of married daughters. So this interpretation, I might say with due respect, was going back and forth in the sense that everybody had a view, right? and there were differing judgments that were given. This went on. In fact, the normal thought or the thought that the society expects is that daughter should have a share in all the family properties, period. Nothing more, nothing less, right? Don't give this technical, hyper-technical interpretations to say that you will not get a share. See, that's the general view. So this was the predominant view, though some courts or some learned judges took a view that, yes, that is the noble object, but our job is not that. Our job is to find out what the section says. What does Section 6 as amended by Section 29A as amended by the 1990 Act and Section 6 as amended by the 2005 Act says is what we are concerned with. If you take that as a standalone, right, for interpretation, then what is mentioned is that daughters only in certain circumstances will become co-partners and get a share. This was the view that was taken. And it took 25 years. It's been, I think, 30 years now. But for the position of law to be settled, it almost took 25 years. And ultimately, there were two landmark judgments on this point. They are, one is the Bombay full bench of the Bombay High Court, which is Badri Narayan Shankar's case. And the second was Prakash versus Poolavati by the Supreme Court, where they said they clarified that daughter might be born at any date. Because there was some confusion as to whether the daughters who are born after 1990 or after 2005 alone acquire a right to the property. So all that got settled, saying that whenever the daughter was born, right, they would get a share in the property. But most importantly, both the judgments laid down that the act, both the acts, 1990 Act and the 2005, was only prospective in application. Being prospective in application, for them to acquire a share, right, there should be a joint family or a co-partnery in existence on the date of commencement of the act. In this context, they said if the father had died prior to the commencement of these enactments, then there was no co-partnery, and therefore the daughters will not get a share. There was a lot of hue and cry on this interpretation, saying that this is not the correct interpretation because the right is right by birth, which was, I might say, erroneously interpreted to say right from birth, right? And saying that this kind of father should be alive interpretation should not be there. And therefore, there was a small difference or a deviation from Prakash versus Poolavati's case in Dhanama's case by the Supreme Court. This resulted in the case getting referred to, this point getting referred to a larger bench in Vineet Sharma's case. In Vineet Sharma's case, the law, as far as I think, when the daughter becomes a co-partner, as to when which and all daughters get a share, all that I think they have only confirmed what is said in Prakash versus Poolavati. They have not yet deviated. But the actual deviation is threefold in this judgment. One, is that the daughter becomes a co-partner on the date of her birth, notwithstanding the act coming into force from 9/9/2005. For example, if the daughter was born way back in 1959, she becomes a co-partner in 1959 and not on 9/9/2005, is the one interpretation that has been given. And the second one is, as I said, the explanation to Section 6, which creates a statutory partition on the death of a Hindu male. They said that explanation will not bind the amendment to Section 6 as under the 2005 Act. And therefore, notwithstanding that explanation, the daughters will get a share in the property. That means, in effect, what they said is, irrespective of when the father died, or irrespective of whether the father is alive or dead, in a joint family property, the daughters will become co-partners and get a share. This is what they have said. See, therefore, if you see, according to me, I'm being the point person here. According to me, there are two salient points that we need to consider as far as Vineet Sharma's case is concerned. One, whether the act having accepted that the act commences only from 9/9/2005, can we say that the daughters became co-partners on the date of their birth, though vesting of the right is only from 9/9/2005? Is the first point. Whether this is accepted or correct in the concept of Hindu law, one. The second one is, what is the effect of the statutory partition contained under the explanation to section 6? So these are the 2 points I think we need to discuss to see if there is an alternate school or a thought process by which the judgment of the Supreme Court might not be correct or requires reconsideration. So first, if we take, I think we will take the notional partition or the statutory partition. If you take the statutory partition, right, see, we'll have to, for that, understand what is a co-partnery. First of all, I think we should go back to this very important point that the 1956 Hindu Succession Act did not deal with the entire gambit of Hindu law. It only dealt with one aspect of property right of a Hindu. That is, on the death, how does his property devolve? That's the only point that is touched. In fact, if we go through the Hindu Succession Act, it does not touch co-partnery at all. It does not take away co-partnery, does not change the formation or the dissolution of the co-partnery. It only says that if a Hindu male dies, right, the property normally which goes to by surveyorship within the co-partnery, if there are female members, should go to the female members also. This was the only change, a very minuscule change that was made to the Hindu law. If you take it in that context, right, then we have to understand what is a co-partnery, because that is something that is not defined or explained, right, in the act. So co-partnery, as I said, is a fluctuating body. And as I said, co-partnery does not come to an end or is not put an end to by either a death of a Hindu or a death of a birth of a member. Neither puts an end to it. It keeps on either shrinking or enlarging depending on the birth and death. So, and the property always remains with the co-partnery. No individual member can claim any right nor claim a share as long as the co-partnery exists. Was the established Hindu law, I think, on which we can have no dispute. Now, given this, the 1956 Act wanted to deviate by saying on the death, it does not touch as far as the birth of a member. It only touched upon death of a member. In case of death of a member, it wanted to say property should go not to the co-partners or remain in the co-partnery, but it should go out and settle upon or devolve upon female members if there are female members. So they wanted to achieve this object. So for this object to be achieved, then the co-partnery has to be broken. Unless a co-partnery is broken, as I said, Hindu law does not permit the co-partnery property to go out. So what was required in 1956 to confer right in a co-partnery property on a Hindu female or daughter or mother or the wife, as the case may be, right, was to break the co-partnery. Because even then they were aware, unless the co-partnery is broken, the property will not come out. Unless the property comes out, it cannot go to a female member. So it was in this juncture, right, or in this context, that explanation to section 6 was intended. Now, if you look at explanation to section 6 as it stood originally under the 1956 Act, right, it says like this, because I might also, before we go to that, I'd also like to point out that a co-partnery could be broken only in two known methods. One is a member saying, I am breaking the co-partnery, something what we call it as severance in status, that I am going independent. If there is an equal declaration to the notice of the other members, then the co-partnery gets broken. The other method is a partition of the properties meets and bounds by the parties, by the members. So these are the only two circumstances under which a co-partnery can be broken. So The legislature or the framers of this law were aware of this. See, they could not impose an actual partition by means and bounds on the parties, saying that you have to divide and this is your share. So what they did, they fell upon severance in status. They wanted to impose a severance in status on a co-partner on the death of a co-partner. That is why they brought in the explanation to section 6. The explanation to section 6 reads like this: provided that if the deceased had left him surviving a female relative specified in class 1 of the schedule or a male relative specified in that class who claims through such female relative the interest of the deceased in the Mitakshara co-partner property shall devolve by testamentary or intestate succession as the case may be under this act and not by survivorship. So what they did, on the death of a person, they brought in a notional partition in the co-partner, saying that once the male member dies, one of the co-partners dies, his property will not go by succession or survivorship, but it will only go to his heirs, be it male, female, including female heirs, as specified in class 1, right? Thereby bringing about a division or a severance in status in the co-partner. So what this explanation actually does is break the co-partner. As far as, see, I do understand that there can be co-partners within co-partners. For example, there is a father and 4 sons. Say each of the sons have 2 sons. So there is a larger co-partner consisting of father, 4 sons, and the grandsons. And there is a smaller co-partner of each son with his sons. Therefore, when one of the sons died, the larger co-partner by the statute is broken. It is put an end to. There is no longer a co-partner in view of this division in status that is brought about by the explanation. Therefore, what happens is, once the co-partner is broken, it becomes property, separate properties in the hands of the respective. The shares are ascertained. Once the shares are ascertained, that share, insofar as each member is concerned, becomes a separate property. For example, one of the sons, right, that share along with the father share becomes ascertained separately. Each of the son shares becomes ascertained separately. If one of the son dies in that 4 sons, for example, right, then the property in the hands of that branch becomes co-partner property in a sense and separate property. In fact, if I may deviate little, this is where the Supreme Court, in my respectful opinion, went wrong in Uttam Singh's case, right? Because if you read the original section 6, right, it says devolution of interest in co-partner property. When a male Hindu dies after the commencement of this act, having at the time of his death an interest in the Mitakshara co-partner property, you should underline this word, having at the time an interest in the Mitakshara co-partner property. For example, we stop for a moment here. We take our example, father, 4 sons, grandsons, right? Say one of the son dies. What is his interest? His interest, first of all, in the larger co-partner is 1/4 or 1/5. I'm sorry, 1/5. Father, 4 sons, 1/5 share, right? Then in this 1/5 share, he cannot take the entire 1/5. He's got 2 sons. So his interest in the larger co-partner property was only 1/15. Right? Now, if you read this, when a Hindu male dies after the commencement of this act, having at the time of his death an interest in the Mitakshara co-partner property, his interest in the property shall devolve by survivorship upon the surviving members of the co-partner and not accordance with this act, provided if there is a female heir, it will go as per class 1 heirs. Therefore, what this amendment contemplated was this 1/15th share devolving upon the class 1 heirs, which is mother, wife, daughter, and sons, or grandchildren if the mother or son or daughter is not there. Therefore, this act contemplated devolution or succession, inheritance is the correct word, inheritance to that 1/15th share of the deceased son, which was possible because Otherwise, it is not possible is shown by the main section of section 6 itself, which itself says shall devolve by survivorship upon the surviving members of the co-partnership and not accordance with this act. Therefore, the requirement was that there has to be a breaking up of the co-partnership, which is brought about by the explanation. Therefore, what happened is that 1/15th share went by inheritance rather than survivorship. As far as the other shares are concerned, as we know that the smaller co-partnership is there and it will continue to be co-partnership property. So the explanation to section 6 is the most important part of section 6. It is the engine that drives the implementation of section 6. If you take away the explanation, 6 has no meaning because there is no breaking up of the co-partnership. If there is no breaking up of the co-partnership, a co-partner or a deceased co-partner will never get separate property because there is no partition. It will only remain within the co-partnership. Then female heirs cannot get a share. So the section 6 explanation to section 6 is the most important part of section 6, which alone brings about the implementation of the main provision, which is the conferment of shares in the female heirs. So now we understand as to why the explanation was given. Now, if you take this, that means as far as the son and his sons are concerned, or the larger family is concerned, there is a breaking up of the co-partnership. Say, for example, the father, such a father died, that such a son died in 1972. So in 1972, the family of father and 4 sons, the co-partnership is broken. Each of them became, see, it is all, I'm not going into the technicalities or the advanced positions in Hindu law by saying that the other 4 can continue, right? They might continue. That is again up to them. But we will take a normal case. We will case where there is a breaking up of the co-partnership and each of them become entitled to 1/5 share, right? Therefore, as far as the branch of the deceased son is concerned, right, the co-partnership comes to an end. Correct? So in 1972, the co-partnership has come to an end. Therefore, if the daughter, for example, this father, apart from the 4 sons, had a sister, had a daughter, right, who is the sister of these 4 sons, right, she will not get any share because in 1972, she had no share in the property. She was not given share. It is only the daughter, wife, and mother of the deceased son who have been given shares. So that 1/4 share then devolves within that family. Therefore, what has happened is in 1972, the law has brought about a partition in that family. Partition in the sense, not by metes and bounds, by ascertainment of shares, which is nothing but severance in status. See, to say that this explanation is totally devoid of any effect on the main provision of section 6 would be abrogating the concept of severance in status. Because severance in status still holds good today because it is not even touched by the Hindu Succession Act. It is not that co-partnership is abrogated by Hindu Succession Act or severance in status is abrogated by Hindu Succession. All that is not happening. In fact, the section 6 of the 1956 Act recognizes severance in status, gives effect to it by and through this explanation in section 6. Therefore, what has happened is there has been a severance in status. Once there has been a severance in status, there is no joint family. Then, therefore, between the father, 4 sons, and the daughter, there is no joint family as of 1972. Father is entitled to 1/5 share. Each branch is entitled to 1/5 share. This is the position. Then we come to in, say, 2005. The 2005 Act says daughters also, married daughters also have a share. Now, what happens to this family? If we go by Vineet Sharma, the law is it will become 1/6 share, irrespective of whether the father is there or not. Irrespective of any member is not there or not, the joint family or the co-partnership continues, is the interpretation that is given by in the Supreme Court in the Vineet Sharma's case. They say it continues. Daughter will also get a share, 1/6 share. But my humble view is that the family having broken up in 1972, how can in 2005, what has happened be undone and a right be conferred on the daughters? Particularly, if you look at the opening sentence of Section 6. Opening sentence of Section 6 is, on and from the commencement of Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005, in a joint family governed by Mitakshara law, the daughter of a co-partner shall by birth become a co-partner. So what is need to be remembered or underlined is in a joint family governed by Mitakshara law. See, joint family is used in the sense of a co-partner. Because if you read the next sentence, the daughter of a co-partner shall. See, it is just the loose wording that is creating this confusion. It should read like this: on and from commencement of Hindu Succession Act, Amendment Act 2005, in a co-partnery, Hindu law co-partnery, governed by Mitakshara law, the daughter of a co-partner shall by birth become a co-partner in her own right in the same manner as a son. This is how it should be read. So what it requires is the existence of a co-partnery or a joint family on 9/9/2005. It is only in that condition or situation the daughters have been made a co-partner equal to that of a son. But if you take our case, 1972, there has been a breaking of the co-partnery. Only smaller co-partneries exist. The larger co-partnery does not exist. Therefore, the daughter, that is the sister of the four sons, when she gets a right on 9/9/2005, the larger co-partnery is not there. It has already in stance broken. Severance in status has happened. Therefore, she cannot become a co-partner. See, I think if you take Section 6, if the explanation, the importance of the explanation to Section 6 is understood and appreciated in the way I am putting it across, right? Then I think this could be the only plausible explanation to the new act, which says on and from 9/9/2005. This is one argument. See, let us look at it in another way. See, okay, laws are made by the parliament. It is all interpreted by the lawyers and the judiciary. And we have a field day in giving different interpretations like what we are doing today, right? But what is the position of the common man? As far as the position of the common man and what we have been telling the litigants or the parties, they might not even say end up in a case. Even when there is an amicable partition, people come to us and ask us, look here, what is my right in the property? What is my daughter's right in the property? What is my son's share in the property? Say prior to 2005. We would have applied the old section. We would have applied the notional partition contemplated under the explanation and said, look here, now that one son has died, there has been a division in status, right? There is a notional partition that is brought about in the family. The father is entitled to 1/5 share. Each of the son is entitled to 1/5 share, and the daughter is not entitled to any share. This is the advice we would have given. Acting upon this, maybe one of the sons, right? One of the sons would have then done documentation thinking that he is entitled to 1/4 share in the property. He and his family are entitled to 1/5 share in the property. They would have continued to act like that. See, if, for example, if that family had, say, 50 acres, he would have gone under the impression, planned his future on the basis of the interpretation of law as it's then stood, saying that I'm entitled to 10 acres. I will get 10 acres in the family property. Now, suddenly in 2005, there's a new act, which says daughter will also get. Now, if the interpretation given in Vineet Sharma's case is accepted, then it becomes 1/6 share. Suddenly, his 10 acres is becoming 8 acres. So then what happens to the doctrine of legitimate expectation? The laws are being made to make people understand their rights as on that date. As on that date, the law has gone and conferred him with a share of 10 acres. Can another law subsequently undo it? by saying you are only entitled to a lesser share. See, I am not saying Parliament does not have the power. Definitely it has the power. But has the Parliament done it in this 2005 Act? Does it anywhere state in Section 6 as it stands today that whatever notional partition has happened and shares have been ascertained, that will get undone by this Act? So, if I might take it further and give another analogy, see what is happening. We are now punishing unity. In a family, if we take the same case of father and 4 sons, they were not that amicable, or they were not that, there was not that kind of amity or comity in the family. They decided to go for a partition in the year 1980. They would have done a partition, say 10 acres to the father, 10 acres to each of the brothers, sister being given nothing, right? A registered partition is made, matters put an end to. Then there is another family of father and 4 sons who think, okay, fine. See, now that the share has been ascertained, let us remain in common. Let us do a partition when we are a joint family. Let us do a partition much later, right? Now, what happens to these 2 families? One family escapes the clutches of the 2005 Act because they have already done a partition as 10 acres, 10 acres, 10 acres. But a family which has remained united, the person will get punished in the sense, now his 10 acres will become 8 acres. Is that the purpose or the object of this law? I submit that, see, law for divesting of a property, in fact, I also want to say this. When I come to the next point that is raised in the judgment, I will say this. But I say divesting of a share that is already conferred, not by act of parties, by an act of parliament, cannot be divested unless there is a specific provision in the recent current Section 6 of the Into Succession Act. There is no provision which says that whatever has happened, in fact, if you look at the explanation to Section 6, even today continues. It has not been taken off. It still continues in the books, in the Act. So that means even today, Parliament recognizes that concept. Having even under the 2005 Act recognized that concept, can we say, or for that matter, the lawyer fraternity, or for the matter, judiciary say, no, don't look at explanation. It does not have the effect of bringing about an actual partition. I submit that would be definitely an overreach. So when the law still contemplates that, see, and the judgment also says it is only an explanation, right? It only explains the position and it cannot control the main provision. The main provision, the object of the main provision is to confer share on or make the daughter a co-partner and give equal share to that of a son. This is only an explanation. Therefore, an explanation cannot control or overrun the main provision. The main provision is daughter should be given a share. See, I think this kind of an explanation or a reasoning can be given if you read Section 6 in isolation without understanding the concept of co-partner. If you just read Section 6 and say, yes, because there are a lot of judgments, the Supreme Court is right in that an explanation cannot control the main provision. Yes, that is right. But in this case, though couched as an explanation, as I said, that is the engine of the section, but for which this section is redundant. Unless, as I said, unless there is a breaking up of the co-partner, the female heirs cannot get a share. The property will remain within the co-partner. So the engine of this section is the explanation. If looked at that context, then definitely the explanation controls the main provision. Because without the explanation, the main section cannot be given effect to, cannot be implemented. So in that sense, I think the alternate school of thought that the most important part of Section 6 is the explanation, which only gives the power or the right of implementation to the main provision, which is conferment of right on the daughters. In fact, the explanation to Section 6 came up for discussion before the Supreme Court long back. In Gurupad Kandappa's case, The citation is 1978 3 SEC 383, where a similar argument was made that it is only an explanation. An explanation cannot have the power, a statutory power of breaking. See, they went to the extent of saying it cannot break up the co-partnership because it is only an explanation. There, the Supreme Court has clearly held. Again, as I'd like to point out, it is again a full bench of the Supreme Court, which said the statutory partition contemplated under the explanation to Section 6 is much more powerful than a partition brought about by the parties, because this is a statutory partition. And the Supreme Court in the judgment goes to the extent of saying, once the shares are ascertained and vested in the co-partners based on that notional partition, it can never be divested. So in fact, Vineet Sharma's case runs counter to the judgment, because the effect of Vineet Sharma's case is divesting of the share what has been granted by the statutory partition or the notional partition. Therefore, I think that view is much more a correct view, I would say, in the context of Section 6 looked at from the law of co-partnership, rather than looking at Section 6 as a part of a statute. Therefore, my respectful submission, right, would be that once the father dies, so in fact, one more example that I would like to state is the first case to be interpreted on this. That is, see, normally in these cases, we say if the father dies prior to the commencement of the act, then there is a notional partition that takes place, and the daughters, therefore, subsequently will not become co-partners. This first case to be decided on this point is by a bench of headed by Justice Srinivasan of the Madras High Court, which is 1991, 2 MLJ, page 199. That was I think it was immediately after the act came into force. It was a case where the father had died before the commencement of the act. The question arose whether the co-partnership existed when Act 1 of 1990 came into force, so as to make the daughter a co-partner and confer a right upon her. A very, I would not say peculiar, a very knowledgeable explanation is given in the judgment. See, co-partnership can be created only from a common male ancestor. That's the law. Right? Today, it might change after 2005, because we are now talking about something that happened before 2005, before 1990. Original Hindu law, no person can create a co-partnership. Co-partnership is a creature of law created from a common male ancestor. So the common male ancestor is the glue that holds the co-partnership together. Now what happens is, in 2000, when the 1990 Act, or for that matter 2005 Act, the notional partition is contemplated. So when a male father dies, there is a breaking of the co-partnership in view of that explanation. Once the co-partnership is broken, right, then each brother becomes a separate co-partner within his family. The larger co-partnership is not there, or the karta is not there for the co-partnership. If you take my example, the sister, say for example, in 1972, instead of one of the sons, the father dies, right? He has 5 sons and 1 daughter. So the 5 sons, the co-partnership as between the father and the 4 sons comes to an end. There's no co-partnership, there's a severance in status because of the explanation. Co-partnership has come to an end. Act 1990 comes into force. We'll assume this daughter is an unmarried daughter. The question is, will she become a co-partner? More than will she become a co-partner, with whom will she become co-partner? Is the important question. Co-partner, as I said, can be only vertical. It can never be horizontal. Creation of a co-partner can only be vertical. Father, son, grandson, great-grandson. Now, what is happening is, father is not there. Everybody here is vertical, horizontal. So the question is whether a sister can become a co-partner with her brothers. This concept is unknown to Hindu law. A sister becoming a co-partner with a brother. That is the explanation that is given in that judgment, and said, this is unknown to Hindu law. A sister cannot become a co-partner with the brothers. On the commencement of the act, what existed, or the members who existed in the erstwhile co-partner were only the brothers. As far as that female member is concerned, she cannot become a co-partner with the brothers, and therefore she will not get a share. See, this is one other school of thought, one other interpretation to the explanation to section 6. Therefore, what I'm trying to establish here is, whether we like it or not, it is in the statute book. That explanation, I think it is beyond dispute. Maybe we can dispute or discuss the effect of it, but what cannot be disputed is that it brings about a division in status or a severance in status. Once a severance in status is brought about, right, then I submit that there is no co-partnery. If there is no co-partnery, then she cannot become a member. Therefore, to get over this in the judgment, there is one more line of reasoning that is given. What the judgment or the Supreme Court in the Vineet Sharma's case says is a two-date theory. It splits the date on which the daughter becomes the co-partner and the date on which she acquires a right in the co-partnership. Because, as I said, on 9/9/2005, if the father dies in 1972, there is no co-partner. If there is no co-partner, you can't become a co-partner. If you don't become a co-partner, you don't get a share in the property. So, to get over this, the Supreme Court says in that judgment, postulates a two-date theory, which is the daughter will become a co-partner on her birth, on the date of her birth. But the vesting of the property, because this act has no retrospective operation, though she is, say, born in 1967, right? She will not get a property in 1967 because this act has only prospective application on and from 9/9/2005. Therefore, the Supreme Court says she becomes a co-partner in 1967, but she acquires a share on 9/9/2005. Therefore, having become a co-partner in 1967, even if the father dies in 1972, she continues to be a co-partner. Yes, sir. Very good interpretation. But the question is it there in this act? That's the small point, though substantial. See, the question is, can we give such an interpretation? See, this is, I would say that if the intention is to somehow give share to the daughters, maybe this interpretation is right. I will agree with it. But if we are only interpreting section 6 of the Hindu Succession Act, I don't think such an interpretation can be given. Because under Hindu law, I think it is the unshakable position, the succession is never kept in abeyance. Vesting of property is never kept in abeyance. Once a person dies, the property immediately, inheritance or succession immediately happens. The share, that is, if there is no co-partner. We are talking about no. So what happens is, if the daughter becomes a co-partner, say in 1967, when she became, right, the vesting of property cannot happen in 2000 or 9/9/2005 because it is never kept in abeyance. The right to property as well as becoming a co-partner has to happen simultaneously because the right conferred is right by birth. So what we are saying is we are splitting right by birth. One right by birth is right by birth of becoming a co-partner. The other by right by birth is right by birth of inheriting a property or getting a share in the property. See, that kind of a split is unnatural to the law. And secondly, if we look at another position, if you accept this position as correct, I will give an analogy how this cannot be accepted. For example, we take our case. 1970, daughter was born in 67. She has become a co-partner. Father dies in 1972, right? Though the daughter gets a right only on 9/9/2005. Say, for example, the brothers partition the property in 2000. right? The act comes into force in 2005. What happens to the daughter's share? She's a co-partner. So there has been a partition without the participation of a co-partner. Is that partition valid? We lawyers will have field day if this is to be accepted. Then every partition has to be reopened. So we cannot postpone, because as I would say, if this kind of the interpretation given by the Supreme Court is to be accepted, then it is not right by birth. It is right from birth. See, right by birth is not does not connote or denote the date on which they acquire a right to the property. It denotes a concept. The concept being that once you are born, you become a co-partner, and whatever the co-partner owns, you become a part of that. Is what that concept says, right by birth. But Supreme Court, by interpreting the words right by birth as right from birth, now says you become a co-partner on the date when you are born, that is 1967. You continue to be a co-partner, but you get the share only in 99-2005. See, this kind of an interpretation, I would say that in the middle years, that is from the day the daughter was born and the day she has acquired a right, in the middle years, if transactions have taken place, it will put all these transactions to suspect. It will put all these transactions disputable in a court of law. So I think that kind of an interpretation is not contemplated under Hindu law, not contemplated under Section 6, and should not be contemplated, is my humble view, because it will only result in more litigation on the family properties. So to sum up, I think the other school, or according to me, the more acceptable school of interpretation of Section 6 would be, if the co-partner or the father had died before the commencement of the Hindu Succession Act, be it 1990 Act or the 2005 Act, the partition has taken place in the family, though a severance by way of a severance in status. And in such scenario, the daughter will not get a share in the property. I think this would be the correct interpretation, particularly given the consistent view that has been taken over the years. I think there has always been a few odd judgments differing from this. But from 1991, as I said, from the judgment in 1991 to MLJ in 199, till say the Prakash versus Pulavati's case, there are hundreds of judgments of our High Court as well as the Supreme Court, which have taken this view that death of the father prior to the commencement of the act puts an end to the co-partnery and the daughter will not get a share. I think upsetting that position now, I think would not be right, because the only way you can upset it by saying that the explanation to Section 6 is not important. But I think that is also not the right view in view of the view already taken by the Supreme Court, a full bench of the Supreme Court in Gurupad's case. And therefore, I submit that I think that a reconsideration of the Vineet Sharma is required.
Two things are now required. Number one, I just want to thank Ms. Adilakshmi Yogamurthy, the founder of Legal Elite, who is present here with her entire team, for the support and being a knowledge partner. Ma'am, you are welcome. Though you are a little bit delayed, you are not denied to us. So welcome to the session. And Mr. Vijay, I have to very frankly say that the session was brilliant.
Thank you.
It is not in terms of how you elucidate a problem or a situation. It is a logic behind what you say and how to supplement your views. The way in which you have just envisaged the provisions of the Act and the way in which you have approached the judgment and the interpretation you have given for the explanations, pulling or pushing the main section, and the interpretation that can give, if you say that the interpretation cannot be given effect in the absence of provision of law, is something very important. That is life or the Jivan of the section. And in fact, I am unhappy in the way in which the explanation has been removed from section 1 and it has been pushed into section 3, subclass 3 of the section, where we say that the notional partition is contemplated only from 9 in 2005, not before the commercial
That too, it still says males.
male. That's what. So I think there is some element of legislative wisdom lacking somewhere. It remains a gray area. And we are not sure of whether a higher bench is going to be considering more than 3 or with a 5 or something. Who knows? It might happen in the future. So in the meantime, I may just request question to be put. And I have Mr. Srinath Sridevan here. He has raised a pertinent question. His article in CTC was a very pertinent one as that of Mr. Valliyappan. Mr. Srinath, please, can you just put your question straight on to Mr. Vijay?
Vijay, congrats on a brilliant exposition of Vinita Sharma. Just one question which has been troubling me for the last few weeks is, what do you think the effect of the judgment would be on the state amendment, especially section 29A? Or do you think, the lawyers in Tamil Nadu and Andhra can argue that Vinita Sharma may not be really applicable in our states because the law here got changed in 89, I think, and 88, I think, in Andhra, respectively. You think there's a room to make an argument like that, at least to save us from the rigor of Justice Arun Mishra's judgment?
Srinath, to be honest with you, I think once they amended section 6, right, there was an automatic abrogation of 29A. See, the Central Act having given the right to all the daughters, can we now still stick on to 29 and to say that in Tamil Nadu only the unmarried daughters will have share? I think the correct position would be that section 6, the current section 6 will overrule 29A. And we'll have to go by section 6 only.
That's what we say. Between 1989 to 2005, we have the state amendment, state law.
We run by the state amendment.
I may request Adilakshmi Nagarathi to offer her remarks. Ma'am?
Sir?
Yeah, you can just put your suggestions or comments to Mr. Vijay's session.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm just traveling. That's why I'm not able to get connected totally. In fact, whenever I heard the session, it was very, very informative and interesting. Thank you so much for joining in for today's special session, sir. And thanks to Hemalata Madam and Srinivasa Raghavan, sir, for giving me and our team the platform to join in for today's session as the knowledge partner. This will not be the only session we'll be doing, sir. We'll be requesting you for continuous session. It was a very insightful one, sir. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of the Legal Eagles Allied team who have joined in. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, Srinivasa Raghavan, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. One question by Indu Praveen. May I read, sir? What happens to the registration happened in 2017 based on Pulavati's case? Will the registration be overwritten? Is overwritten and given share additionally for daughters based on Vinita Sharma's case? Is a doubt raised by Indu Praveen Kandula.
See, normally the law is the precedents will have to be applied only prospectively. Correct. See, that's the law, right? And secondly, why a registered document? Even if a court partition has taken place, or for example, you even take Prakash versus Pulavati's case. Is the Supreme Court going to reconsider the judgment? There also shares have been allotted. It is also a partition suit. So I think for partitions that have already taken place, right, I don't think judgment has any effect on them.
Mr. Satish asked a question. What will happen to any alienation in between and what will happen to bona fide purchases? He is worried about the bona fide purchases who purchased before 2004. Once the daughter becomes a co-partner because of Vinita Sharma's.
Sir, this entire exercise is for them, sir. They have to be protected or they are all going to be open to litigations.
One more question is that is there any citation for the vertical and horizontal co-partner?
That is there in the Hindu uncodified laws.
Uncodified rights.
Yeah, I suggest you look at Mulla's Hindu law, it is there.
It's there. And one Mr. Jagannathan puts a question. Sir, if the daughter born after 1959 but died before 1989, whether her heirs are getting benefited by Act 39 of 2005?
No, sir, they cannot become co-partners, right?
Co-partner is not co-partner. May I now request Dr. Srividya Jayakumar to offer her comments. She is a principal in a college at Thane near Mumbai.
Good evening to one and all. It was a wonderful session. In fact, family law is not a favorite subject for me, but I think here Advocate Mr. Vijay Raghunath has inspired me to read more on family law. It was very nice. The reframing of the section 6 as it should be understood was really very insightful. Thank you, and best wishes to you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
It was really a very amazing session, and very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Srividya ma'am. With this, we come to the end of the session.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for the privilege session. Yeah. And once again, I thank you for the way in which you have narrated the facts that led to the enactment, narrated the facts that led to the amendment, and narrated the facts that led to the case on hand, and the way in which it has to be approached, and a very thought-provoking session. I hope, as an academician, an advocate should know how and when and how and why the law gets amended, and how should we approach it. One day or another, we may be pushed to face a similar situation. With this note, I thank you once again for the beautiful session, and we'll be keeping on troubling you in future also. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.